Hello and welcome everyone to Stonebelt's webinar, Hidden in Plain Sight, the power of spirituality in inclusive quality supports. I also want to welcome our guest speaker, Reverend Bill Gaventa, who is author, speaker, trainer, and consultant. You will learn more about him and from him here in a moment. I am your host, Reverend Sarah Vanderzee McKenney, the Spiritual Support and Volunteer Coordinator for Stonebelt ARC. Stonebelt is one of the very few ARCs in the country that provides spiritual support services. And for those of you who may not know, Stonebelt is a service provider that offers a wide range of of support services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We are located in Bloomington, Bedford, and Columbus, Indiana. We are a secular organization, which means we are not associated with any one faith tradition. So we strive to offer support to people of any and all faith or spiritual practices. We are also a community-based organization, which means we promote full integration, inclusion, and belonging of people with intellectual and or developmental disabilities into the community. All of this brings me to why we're all here today. Our hope is to take a closer look as to why spiritual supports are so important to quality care of people with disabilities and why this is the role of both the service providers and the faith communities. A few more things before we begin. I want to draw your attention to the donation link at the bottom of this screen, and I will also put it in the chat box here in a few minutes. We are offering these webinars for free. We are offering these webinars for free, but we want to be able to bring you quality speakers to these webinars. So we ask you to consider making a donation. I did say that we do plan to bring you other webinars, and this is our very first year of providing webinars. But our plan is to continue to provide you with about 5 webinars a year on various topics. This is our 2021 webinar schedule from this point on. So we all webinars will be recorded and put into our library that will be stored on our website. So feel free to go back and share this webinar with others. On our webpage, you will find free resources, book suggestions, etc. Now, this is a growing page, so please check back often. If you are in our service area, you can also check out our other services. The spiritual support coordinator, can provide you and your congregation, such as congregation-specific trainings and consultation. If you are outside of our area, feel free to email me and I can try to assist or direct you to supports in your area. And I will also put my email in the chat box. There will be a question and answer time at the end of the presentation, so please type those questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we will try to address those at the end. If we do not get to your question, please email me after this presentation with any further questions. Now, it is an absolute pleasure to introduce you all to Reverend Bill Gaventa. He has a long list of accomplishments to introduce, has a long list of accomplishments and expertise. A few things, though, that I want to draw your attention to is his book, Spirituality and Disability, Recovering Wholeness, as this is a book that will be a great resource and continuation of our conversation today. He is also founder and director emeritus of Institute of Theology and Disability, which is a conference that takes place every summer with lots of resources. He is also editor of Journal of Religion, Disability, and Health, and the current director of National Collaborative on Faith and Disability. Now, the list goes on, but I do want to now hear from you, Bill. Welcome, and thank you so much for your time and sharing your wisdom with us today.
Okay, I don't know if you can see me or not, but I've got the slides on, and Sarah's going to be the one forwarding them as we go along. It's a delight to be here. I've watched with great appreciation and interest as Sarah helped develop and started and is now really working on developing the spiritual supports program at Stonebelt. And I think while it's one of the few ARCs that have that, I think a number of larger secular agencies are beginning to, and some smaller ones are really beginning to take that real seriously because, you know, ideally maybe faith communities would pick that up without needing somebody, but that's not the way that we would say the same thing about communities and inclusion. Well, the community should include people. Well, but we work hard on that, and we've got to work on building those relationships. So, hidden in plain sight, the power of spirituality and inclusive quality supports. Next slide. The premise of my book and part of the talk is just as a background is that disability and spirituality, when you try to understand what one means, it leads to the other and vice versa. And how is that, you might say? Well, let's look at a definition of disability from the World Health Organization. And what essentially you'll see in just a minute here is a way that how we start off trying to define disability in sort of medical, physical, psychological terms, and we end up in the world of meaning and spirituality. Next slide, Sarah. So this is the World Health Organization has this construct about disability, which involves a multitude of factors. There's bodily functions, there's a health condition, there's which impacts a person's activity. That activity can also, the limits there can limit or help somebody's participation in community life. But the level of that activity is also impacted by environmental factors, which include physical environments and social and cultural environments, and is also impacted by personal factors like what I think about my disability, the attitudes I have, just like the environment is impacted by people's attitudes about disability and stereotypes and understandings and whether they're hospitable or not. So when you get down to being able to participate in community life and think about the environmental and personal factors that are there, you really end up in the world of what do people think disability means? And how do I relate to people with disabilities, which are all questions that fundamentally get at spiritual dimensions of life. Next slide. Now, so disability, in other words, spirituality becomes the meaning that we make or take out of disability, what we understand about what it means to us and to others. Those attitudes, self-concepts, stereotypes. How do we change hearts and minds as well as environments we talk about? How do we help inclusion to happen? You can do it through laws and regulations, but that's not the same thing. Those create a space, but they don't create relationships. Now, spirituality goes the other direction in a sense. If you read a lot about spirituality or that's an important area of life for you, you know that's an area of life that brings meaning to your life, however you may express that and experience that. They're all questions that fundamentally get at spiritual dimensions of life. Sarah, I'm hearing a background. Anyway, I'll go ahead. Spirituality, Christina Polchowski says that at the George Washington Institute on Spirituality and Health, that spirituality is a dimension of a person that seeks to find meaning in his or her life. It's also the quality that supports connection to and relationship with the sacred, as well as each other. Next slide. So how do we find meaning in our lives, especially in times of crisis A lot of people write about, a lot of spiritual writings come out of times of crisis, out of times of limitation, out of times of sometimes towards the end of life, of grief and loss, at times of celebration. One of my favorite little pieces about this is an Australian cartoonist named Michael Leunig, who has got this wonderful little poem that goes like this. God bless this tiny little boat and me who travels in it. It stays afloat for years and years and sinks within a minute. And so the soul on which we sail, unknown by years of thinking, is deeply felt and understood the minute that it's sinking. Those times when we go along and just sort of sail along, but those times when there's a crisis, all of a sudden core, important, deep questions also come up for us. And sometimes we seek to find those and explore those on a regular level. He wrote that, by the way, in the midst of a fairly major depression. Next slide. So spirituality, think about it as a twofold definition, a functional definition. It's an experience with the sacred or holy, however you might define that, and that could be defined in religious terms, in terms of participation in a faith tradition. It could, and it's also then about core meanings and values and how we cope with our lives and what guides us as we journey through life. To talk about and then with a certain sense of connection, the connections can be, we talk about to know ourselves, connections with self, connections with others, connections with God or whatever we think is holy, and connections with places and with time. If I ask you the question, what are the most sacred places for you? You could probably name some where you feel particularly attuned to kind of the meaning and depths of the universe. And some cultures are more connected to a sense of time, to the past or the future, and the role of ancestors, and the way history lives with us in different times. Next slide, Sarah. So why the gap, though, in disability services and supports? And in mental health services as well. Why the gap between the disability services and supports that most systems offer publicly and then spiritual communities in the world of spirituality? There are a bunch of different reasons. There's no one special one, but a couple of, just to name some of them. For many people, spirituality is seen as a private matter, not something that's public, or they want to be known, or we shouldn't address it publicly, when in fact, when they're saying that, usually it's a way of saying it's about stuff that really means a lot to me, and I'm not sure I want to share that with other people. There's a false understanding about what it means to separate church and state in this country. Just because an agency or system gets federal dollars doesn't mean it can't pay attention to spirituality. It means it shouldn't proselytize, but it shouldn't try to force people to be, quote, religious in any direction in order to receive services. But it's a false separation to say that because we're state funded or federally funded, we can't address spirituality and spiritual needs and supports. There's a gap sometimes in understandings between science and religion, each of them with stereotypes about the others. And that would be a whole lecture or lots of time. There are lots of things written about that. In the world of intellectual and developmental disabilities in particular, there's a false equation of faith with our capacity to reason. People think that, oh, how can they be people of faith? Or because what do they understand? How do they understand particular beliefs? Or how does somebody understand death? And I would simply say that faith, for instance, to the Apostle Paul, was about faith, hope, and love. It was not about belief and creed, but it's more of an experience of faith and spirituality rather than necessarily intellectual ability to understand. Lots of us don't understand core religious or spiritual things in the fullness we would like to. Those two helping systems have different languages for helping. You know, if you're working in the service system and talking to friends or others, and you start using all the nicknames and acronyms and so on that come out of the world of DD services, people are going to look at you and say, what are you talking about? And the same thing with people in human support services. If they go to the different faith traditions and people start talking in the language and traditions of those particular faith communities, they're going to not be so sure about that. And it's even made more problematic because there's so many different faith traditions. Like, how do we understand, how do we know how to talk to each of those in their own tradition? Nobody's ever gotten trained much on how to do that, on how to, from the service provider side. This is an example today of beginning to, how do we get some training in addressing spirituality and working with faith communities or other kinds of spiritual forms of expression. And in faith communities, there have also been growing attempts and projects and initiatives to help educate clergy and congregational leaders about the importance of welcoming and including people with disabilities. And in those two worlds, the two worlds are also afraid of each other. When people say, I'm not sure we want to get our people involved in church or religion, oftentimes they've heard stories about things, bad things that have happened, or bad experiences that people with disabilities that their families have had. And when they say, I don't want to know if we should get into that, that's partly saying that's a recognition of the power, even if it's negative. And then people on the religious side sometimes are just uncertain or envious sometimes about the salaries that people can make in human services, or that it seems like those are the ones that those services don't pay any respect or attention to this world of spiritual beliefs and experience that we think is so important. So each have had bad experiences with the other. Next slide, please. So what are some of the rationales, though, on the other side for invoking and including spirituality? One, tapping the power of the sacred in people's lives, in everybody's life, tapping that sense of power, the sense of whatever it is, the wonder, the meaning, what's most important to somebody, what's their passions, tapping that power. It's often the way that people find meaning and cope with life. It could be through a religious faith or spiritual understandings of their life and the kinds of issues that they're dealing with. If we say we're going to be culturally competent in our day, which all agencies are required to do, we've got to pay attention to the different cultural traditions from which people we serve and support come. And those traditions are often, at the heart of those traditions are often religious understandings and ways that impact those cultures. And so they're mixed together, pretty profoundly mixed together. We talk about self-determination these days, and so if it's people's right to choose and to choose for themselves, it's not our responsibility to choose whether or not people would like to address their spirituality, but it's our responsibility to support them in the choices that they have. And there's more and more research that's showing how regular spiritual participation makes a difference in the quality of life and even the physical health of people, all kinds of people, not just people with disabilities. You've also got to think about the spirituality of the staff in your agencies. We all have reasons and meaning and commitment to working there. And we all know the difference between a agency that feels good and exciting and growing versus one where you feel like things are just not very well here. How do we enhance the commitment and the meaning that people draw out of their lives? And how do we pay attention to the soul of the organization in which we work, whether that's a faith community or an agency? And particularly, in other words, very concretely, how do we help the people we support and serve deal with grief and loss throughout their lives, not just at the end of life? Because for people with disabilities in particular, grief is often an ocean that they're swimming in that we don't often pay attention to. Next slide. Also think about spirituality at life transitions. For many families, the kinds of supports that they get at the birth of a child with a disability or the diagnosis of a disability, that's a crisis. and the kinds of supports that they get in those times are crucial, including being able to find the right services, but also being able to get support from other families, from whomever they turn to in their lives, usually for support and community. Faith communities can be an opportunity for inclusion from very early on, starting with the church nursery or the synagogue nursery, and then into religious education and grow. If one can start early and grow up with the other kids in a faith community, you've got a lab and inclusion already going on. Think about the importance of rites of passage for many people and families. The importance of baptism, the importance of first communion, a bar mitzvah, all those symbols and rituals that say you belong to us and you're part of our community. And there's some great movies out there about that. Think about the crisis of transition when people age out of education and go into adult services. And for many, and it could be our transitions in moving from one country to another. For most immigrants and ethnic religious organizations, for immigrants, those are sanctuaries that help them in their attempt to come into this country and become citizens, wider citizens. But faith communities could also be places that really give support to people who've aged out of education, who've been part of us, as we help them perhaps to find ways to make a contribution to their community, ways to get jobs. We did a project, and you can get the manual for it, called Putting Faith to Work, which is around working with congregations to help people who they know with disabilities find jobs in their communities. And that all is tapping the power of the social networking and the social capital that happens to be in the congregation as a whole. And again, then dealing with grief and loss throughout life. Sarah, next slide. And more. If you talk about, there are 335,000, give or take, congregations in this country. Think about that as natural community support organizations. It's one of the biggest networks of those kinds of helping organizations that there is in this country. Faith communities are also the most significant source of donations, volunteers, and community leadership. And think about, in terms of faith communities, if you're working with provider agencies, think about for them the importance of seeing an agency and its staff act out of their call and mission and their commitment to supporting people that you serve, like at Stone Belt. Those faith communities need to know the spirit and the commitment of the staff who are really committed to helping build quality of life for the people they support. And think about the power of congregations as networkers to employees or potential co-workers. Next slide. So an individual is in the middle of these families, faith communities, and service systems. So there's an overlap there. And how do we enhance the collaboration between all of those different groups to help pay attention? And we need to pay attention to it. Otherwise, you're leaving a gap, which the next slide, Sarah, shows a little bit more closely. If you think of spirituality as being at the heart of life for all of us, that all of us have a spiritual dimension, that's a dimension of individuals and families. It's also a dimension of faith communities. It's also at the heart of community. You know, to be in a community that feels alive and feels growing, there people are paying attention to the soul of that community and the participation of everyone in the life of that community. So think about spirituality. What is it at the heart? Now, if you haven't seen this, Erik Carter is one of the people who's been doing researching on asking families with people with disabilities and people with disabilities themselves about what they would like from faith communities and what it would mean to them to feel like they belong to faith communities. And this is not a theoretical model imposed on the data. This is a model that came out of the data about what it means to belong. And look at these 10 dimensions. To belong means to be present, to be invited, welcomed, known, accepted, supported, cared for, befriended, needed, where I can do something and contribute myself and to feel loved. That sense of, and if you look at that's what belonging means for many of us, for most of us. And it could be also what it means to have a sense of belonging to a local civic group or some other organization, those dimensions. But particularly, those are dimensions that are at the heart of faith communities and spiritual communities or organizations. Next slide. Now, come back to the heart of the values in our DD services. Every agency has, in the US at least, has, because of the DD Act, addresses the values of independence, productivity, integration or inclusion, self-determination, cultural competence, and now the HCBS standards of community first as a way to think about services and supports. At the heart of those questions, back, Sarah, a minute. At the heart of those questions of independence is the question of identity. Who am I? We in America say we're supposed to be independent, but it's a question of identity. What defines me? What makes me unique? The productivity is why am I? And we say, well, go get them jobs, but it's where do I contribute? What's my purpose in life? And a job is one way for that. The integration question is the who's am I question. It's the who do I belong to? Who am I connected to? And self-determination, how am I given choices? And how can I shape my life? Okay, next slide. So person-centered means starting with us and who we are, the question of identity. Who am I? Who is the person that I'm supporting? There's a really fun little exercise I would encourage you to do in a group sometime. Is to take a piece of paper, write I am, and then list 10 qualities, interests, passions, hobbies that help define who you are, that are core to who you are as a person. And you cannot use your job title because too often that's the only way we think we've got some kind of identity. If you do that, it could use qualities, again, all those roles. I'm a grandmother, I'm a gardener. You think about, I'm a pet lover. You think about, do that, and then share what you've got with the rest of the group it's with. All of a sudden, what you're doing is finding out things about people you didn't know, and you're also finding out about ways that people can possibly connect around common interest or shared commitments or different kinds of roles. Next slide. So thinking with the steps, starting with person-centered planning that everyone tries to do these days, and good person-centered planning has got to include spirituality. If it's not included, it's not being. I would say it's really failing to pay attention to a really important dimension of people's lives, and a dimension that's got lots of treasures and potential resources to help with inclusion. You've got to think about agency policies and staff training and supports to help people's dreams and wishes and choices become real. You've got to begin connecting with faith communities and learn how to make introductions between people you support, between yourself and as an agency and people in the faith communities. Don't just show up on a Sunday morning or a Saturday morning or program. Get to know people beforehand. Have people get introduced to each other beforehand. So you move beyond, these are labels of a few people with disabilities are going to want to come to our church. Those introductions are so important to get people to know each other individually. Work with congregations to help develop awareness and education, and then think about this as a shared responsibility to address the movement to welcome and help people move from beyond just attending on Sundays at other times towards a sense of really getting involved in the life of that community, of a sense of belonging and making contributions to it. Next slide, Sarah. So you could start in-person centered. There are a variety of ways to how to address the issue of spirituality. There's a simple one that comes out from the George Washington Institute. You don't have to use this. You could just start with your own questions as part of the planning to say, adapt some of these. For instance, the FICA we know because it's all on our paychecks. Do you have Do you consider yourself a spiritual person? Do you have a preference? Are you part of a religious tradition? Is it an important part of your identity? What's your preference? What would you preference be? Have you been to faith communities? Would you like to try some? How important is that to you? How would you like it to influence your life? How does it influence your life? What kind of communal expression might you like that to take? What would you like to do? And some people's biggest passion in life, I don't know, maybe being an Indianapolis Colts fan, and they would love a chance to be part of a group of fans that worship the Colts, so to speak, and watch football games together. That would be a real kick to them. And then assistance. How do we as an agency help you with that? How can we walk along beside you in that? Not do it for you, but walk along beside you with that. And there are a variety of different kinds of ways to ask those questions to include in your person-centered planning processes. And you can figure out, there's some in some resource sections, but you can figure out some that are appropriate to you and what you're doing. Next slide. Questions you could ask. Are you interested? Do you belong, or have you belonged to a particular tradition in the past? Which one was it? Do you know anybody there? Does your family know anybody there? What do they do there? Or do they do things at that faith community that you'd like to do more of if they are attending already? Well, I'd like to help. I'd like to do something. I just don't want to just go. And do we have this as part of our action plan about how we can work on this and begin to move towards that? Next. Are there other ways that a person observes their religion or spiritual? What's most important to them? Go back to that I am question, the passions, the core senses of one's identity. Jeff Kaufman, who's written a book on grief and loss and helping people with intellectual disabilities mourn, suggests doing a loss assessment with individuals and families when they come into services. So the agency knows that when there's a loss in the extended family, they know what the traditions are, how a person has been involved and what kind of traditions in the past. Also, as a way of setting up with families and individuals, this is what we're going to do when a time comes when maybe somebody close to you is really sick or dies or something. And this is why we think it's so important that we'll help you with that, not to ignore it or not to get out of the whole trap that we don't want people with disabilities to go to funeral services. Are there festivals or special occasions people like? Are there other things someone would love to do? And then what does the family think about all this? And would they might love for their son or daughter to be part of a wider community, but they perhaps have had a hard time with that in the past. Next slide. We had a pastoral student in New Jersey who worked for an ARC in New Jersey, and she trained and worked with the direct support staff and others to essentially ask, what's most important to you, to all the people they supported. And they took all their answers from people and then she kind of grouped them, and then her husband did a wordle with it. And as you know what a wordle is, the more a particular phrase or word was said, the bigger those words are. So here's an agency that served several hundred people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And these were some of the things that were most important to you. And look at some of them. A lot of them are about relationships or missing people that they knew in the past, even if it was at an institution that they moved out of. Or I need help to get to a congregation. My best friend I've lost. How do we help people keep up relationships? My best friend died. I need a friend to sit with. My mom died. What's cancer? My pop died. You know, all these kinds of questions that are about relationships and connections and what's really important and most important in somebody's life. So just gives you a hint of what kind of the spiritual dimensions that are there that we often don't see. Next slide. So what do we need? We need people with Parents and people with disabilities have said in their own words to Erik Carter and to others, we need faith communities that offer welcoming and positive attitudes. They may not know what to do, but they want to say they want somebody to be welcoming and let's work on this together. You need environments to be accessible for some people. You need to provide education and training to congregational members so they know who's coming and participating, and get them introduced so that they feel more comfortable relating to people with disabilities if they've not had much experience in the past. Need to be able to offer support during the services. And for families who are taking a kid or an adult who lives with them to the church, this is a way where the faith community can really begin to help by not making it just the parents' responsibility to sit with them. Getting to know somebody who's coming with a parent or family and say, would you like to sit with somebody your age or somebody you've gotten to know? For that might provide a real sense of kind of respite for the family, but it also might helps an individual get to know other people in the congregation. What kind of supports can we give the other 6 days or outside of the worship services? And we'd like opportunities to be able to serve, to help, not just to be the receivers of help, but to be able to help others in the context of our communities. Okay, next slide. So from plans to action, got to have support from the top, from the agencies. It's not, and this from the top down, and this is not just, should not just fall in direct support professionals. If you're going to have some people start going to faith communities and working with them, it ought to, some of the professional staff need to show up there as well, because this is a way, remember, for faith communities to get to see the heart and soul of an agency in action around trying to help the people they support and serve get more connected into the community. And for many direct support professionals, many sometimes who are immigrants, they are not nearly as familiar with the community or with faith traditions as others may be. So staff training and awareness, using internal networks. Oh, somebody comes to Sarah and says, I've got a guy who's Roman Catholic. He really wants to go to mass at this particular church, at this particular parish. And maybe Sarah says, well, let's see if we have any staff who go to that parish or who are Catholic, who might be able to help you make the connection there. Use those networks to, who do you know who knows? So this is not starting a program, but building relationships. Be sensitive to staff concerns and anxiety, especially when you're asking staff to help accompany somebody to a faith tradition that's very different from their own. Remember, you're not asking them to become a member of that tradition. Their job is there to help support the person they're taking and also help them introduce the person they're taking to other people and get them involved more in the life of that community. How do we be creative with transportation? If in the normal world, if somebody says to a congregation, I really would like to come, but I can't get there, the congregation would figure out who could stop by and pick them up. Well, to so many people who work in who live in agency-supported living arrangements, the rules won't let volunteers do that, and we've got to move past that. It's an issue of risk management, but risk assessment. And if you think about, if you trust a congregation who's trusting people who might offer to volunteer to come with somebody, figure out a way to do that without making it so hard for them to do something that's a natural, normal act that they just give up. Think about other agency barriers to community participation. Start, like in supported employment, doing one by one. Don't start with taking groups, because that can overwhelm any particular, any group at all. It's all about building relationships. Participation wants to build inclusion, but you need the relationships to widen that. Whose job then? Everybody becomes a community builder in an agency. Think about that. Everybody who works for an agency potentially could become a person who could help network or connect or introduce one of the people you serve to somebody who shares a faith tradition or a passion or an interest that they may share, or they may know other people in the community who does. Starting at home, both with ourselves and with congregations, and work towards here. how do support agencies like Stone Belt welcome and receive people from the community who are coming in? Are you hospitable to others in the same way you want others to be hospitable to you and the people you work with? Share the responsibility between those two systems and those worlds. And think then about this role that Sarah's doing and other people are beginning to doing about a spiritual supports coordinator, or if you're a number of smaller agencies, band together and maybe do that on a part-time basis, or have somebody do part of their job with something else with the agency and do that as part of their role. That becomes a way of paying attention to all the multiple dimensions of this. Next slide, Sarah. Now, what you're getting into is really good community building. And think about helping people get involved in community and congregations as being a real exercise in what it means to learn how to help build communities and inclusion. And in community building, you need to focus on people's gifts rather than needs. We build service systems out of needs. We don't build service systems out of gifts. Think about what's unique, what's great about a person. How do we want other people to get to know this person? And you can help with the needs as go along, but you want people to see more than just the disability. You want people to see Jane or John or Jim or Roger and their faith and their story. Think about capacity rather than deficits, about the capacity of communities to welcome. When they say we don't know how, you might say, well, we're not asking you to do anything different than what you do for anybody else. Because what you do and in the ways you welcome people and help them become part of you, that would be so incredibly important to the people we're working with and them. And we can help you with a disability part. And think again about the relationships, the mutuality. Think about this as friendships and partnerships and colleagues rather than staff, client, or minister, congregant. Think about the mutuality of relationships, coming back to relationships. Sarah? So one of the things I learned after a long time was if you want to introduce a person considered other by whatever their label, to people in the community, whether in a church or other places. I spent years trying to do that direct connection, which often got bogged down in people's fears or anxieties or stereotypes about disability or whatever. And it finally, out of all the good community building people in the country, and the work I was doing, what worked, and then began to say, wait a minute, don't go directly, but find out the third thing that can help connect people. When you get on a plane, or when you used to get on planes or go somewhere and a stranger was next to you, you might start talking and you'd get to the point where there's something that connects the two of you, and that would open up a world of conversation. So go back to those passions, those parts of people's identities. What are those third things that might connect somebody that you're supporting with other people in the community? So if somebody's Roger, who was Catholic before and wants to go to the Catholic parish, but Roger is also a sports fan of say the Colts, then as you're working with a parish, you might want to say to the people you get connected to with the parish, are there any Colts fans here? Because Roger would really like to meet some other Colts fans. And that would and he doesn't ever get the chance to talk to people about Colts fans and what the coach is doing right or wrong or whatever. And that would be, for Colts fans, a tragedy, not be able to talk with people who share those passions. So again, think about what are those third things? What is it? Who are other people who share those passions? Where do those people gather? When do they gather? How might we get them connected to those people? And think about then why they might want to be welcoming and embracing and why it be so important about what a difference they can make in somebody's lives. Next slide. So those third things, you'll get the PDF of these. So I don't need to go through all of this, but the what, those passions and interests. Who do you know who knows? Think about using those 6 degrees of separation. And then, because it's always better if you can get somebody to introduce you as a staff person who's in that congregation to somebody in the congregation or know where to go to. But if you're going to have to introduce yourself cold, then do it again somewhere outside of the worship service on Sunday morning, when everybody who's leading that service is kind of really busy. Make plans for that, or think about going even then next step, maybe going with the people who'd like to go to that faith community, go during the week and walk through what a service might look like so they understand. Where do people gather with those interests? Where do the music fan, where do the country music folks gather? Where do whoever, when do those gatherings happen? And the roles we take on as staff and community builders is to find the askers in the community, people who are really good at asking others to get involved. The introducer, introducing people out of the full depth of who they are, not just out of the disability. Think of yourself as a coach to other people, not you doing it all, but teaching other people, showing people how to do, to be more comfortable in this welcoming game. Think of the role as sometimes cultural broker if you're moving into a different culture, or spiritual supports coordinator. Think about the hows. Now, everybody can play part of those roles. For bigger groups, you may need to have particular roles who works then with everybody. Don't get it just tied to one person. Beginnings and introductions. Who do you know? Visits beforehand. Meet people who may assist. And some faith communities, for instance, have developed not quote a volunteer, but maybe a spiritual companion, a member in the congregation who'd be willing to sit with, get to know, and help a person get more involved in a faith community. And it's even better if a few people would volunteer to do that. So no one person feels that it's always up to them. And the person maybe coming from your group home or supported living feels like there's several people in the congregation they know. And there you've got the beginnings of a circle of support. There's a great little film that's later on in the resources called Believing, Belonging, Becoming, which is 4 stories about that happening in some faith communities. Next slide. Learning the languages. If you're going into any kind of community organization or faith community, you've got to be careful about speaking the languages of service communities and intellectual disabilities. That's not the language that the community uses, and you know it. The languages of community are languages of art and symbol, poetry, values, vision. Think about what is the vision of a faith community you might want to be working. What's their mission? And how you might say that helping to include Roger, helps them fulfill their mission, not just the mission of the Stone Belt Arc. Storyteller, tell stories about the people in introductions, help people get to know the people that they are part of and let them tell their own story. Let them tell so other people can hear it as much as possible. Remember, as you do this and working on that, you're inviting people into a journey that might help somebody be included, but you're also inviting them into a journey that's going to potentially push buttons inside them and other kinds of feelings and lead towards new kinds of growth within them. So it's both an outward and an inward journey. And you're the huge role for people in agencies and say advocates in congregations who are helping to welcome people and help other people get involved is to celebrate every good thing that happens and every connection. Note the significance of what may seem like small acts to others and bless what they're doing. A pastor doesn't need to lead all this. A pastor can bless the congregation and support the people who are doing it. So make sure you think about gifts from the very beginning, the gifts of the people who are getting involved, and celebrate those. Next slide. Out of a book called Exclusion and Embrace, Not the World from Disability, Christian theologian Miroslav Volf says, are we called to embrace the other? And mostly those of us who grew up in Sunday school would say, oh yeah, we are supposed to do that. No, he says, no, we're not called to, we're called to have the will to do so. Doesn't mean we can do it right away. So just to give you an idea about some of what happens and the kind of the yin and yang of these relationships. Next slide, Sarah. That kind of dance means we move towards people with our arms open, hoping to connect with them. But the thing you don't want to happen is somebody to come for you, for instance, if a stranger came to you, might move towards you, but you wouldn't want a stranger to come and hug you all of a sudden. Like, that's violating my space too quickly. You want people to move towards each other, but then maybe step back a little bit. Again, this is all metaphorically, and learn to listen to each other, learn to get to know each other, listen to yourselves and to each other, and then move towards a kind of genuine kind of connection and friendship. It's a bit of kind of a dance. So you can't expect people to be welcoming all at once, especially if they've had not much experience. Next slide. A long time ago, early in my career, another chaplain told me, he said, Bill, people move from fear of disability to pity to anger when they get to know people and realize the barriers they face and the struggles they've had and get angry about that, to then a sense of love where they begin to feel like I may be helping that person, but they're doing a whole lot for me. I'm the one who's receiving here too. And that's also the way our systems have moved historically, from fears that put people in institutions to specialized services doing things to and for people, to anger about social justice and advocacy and civil rights, to then a sense of membership and contribution in communities. Rights will get you spaces in communities, but they don't necessarily build relationships and memberships and connections. Next slide. But people will go through those in their own style. Every single question is valid. Focus on their capacity as you're working with a faith community to do what you cannot. Sarah could go to a Catholic church and say, I'm a minister, I'm ordained Presbyterian, but I'm not Catholic. You guys know what it means to be Catholic. You know what to do at a mass. So our staff don't know that. We really need Catholic people who are really Catholic to work out of the gift you have of being Catholic to help the person that we'd like to connect with you. Offer support for anything, but don't do it all. Deal honestly with any concerns about behavior. To just say, oh, just accept issues and behavior is not going to work, because if that gets problematic and nobody just, oh, we have to tolerate that because they have a disability, well, that's going to lead to a blow up. And help people learn how to work with and help teach people the kind of what's often the hidden curriculum in congregations about what you do and when you do it and where. And to do that, to learn that, you've got to have time to practice. And think about how we help people learn the culture of a particular congregation or faith community. Next slide, Sarah. And learn to speak a little bit about the theological dimensions in this in terms of hospitality to the stranger, remembering the body, the whole people of God, helping the body to become whole. The faith community as a safe place, as a sanctuary, where we see people's gifts and help them be put to work, where we not are just called to support people with disabilities, but where people with disabilities are also called to be God's disciples and servants as well. And how we learn, again, to express our spirituality through many things other than our intellectual abilities and reason and beliefs. Next slide. There are a bunch of resources out there now, lots of them. The question is just getting the ones that work and are right for you. That video there, and Sarah can send you the connection to that. There are written resources and web pages almost from every single faith tradition, and then from lots of other faith community networking groups that work on inclusion. There are other people doing the same thing. Put the word out, you know. If First Methodist Church of Bloomington is really doing a good job, you can point people towards First Methodist Church and say, see what they're doing, learn from them. You know, in congregations, people will often say, well, if that church can do it well and it's really working well there, well, we should be able to do it. You know, there's friendly competition in faith communities just like there is in agencies. And if you think about being willing to work on interfaith and ecumenical bases to simply share what you each are learning and learn from each other, you're not trying to change somebody's faith tradition, you're sharing what you're learning about how best to include people in the full life of a faith community, not just the worship services or religious education. Next slide. I'm just going to say this, use what you don't know. You know, if you don't know, ask somebody who does, and so that they can help teach you that people have got gifts that others got that you cannot give. People may have gifts to help with this that they don't recognize. It's a way for people to put their faith and values into action. You want your folks that you're working with disabilities to go from being unnoticed to noticed, but also known, and to think about it as moving from Stone Belt Arc saying, these are our people, to a church saying, no, they're part of our people too. Along with that, it's about where people have a real sense of belonging, from moving from inclusion to real belonging. Next slide, Sarah. There are other resources which you can get from the slides, some state efforts to do this. Erik Carter and friends have got some really good how-to kinds of guides on the Vanderbilt Kennedy website under faith issues. There's a webinar series that we did that started with how do you get started with this on an agency on the one hand to all the way at the other end to some congregations who are really doing this well, with about 5 and spaces in between that. So there's some other resources. And finally, next slide. Our next slide. You saw the slide at the beginning. If you want to have a look at my book, it covers a lot of this and lots of different community building things, spirituality of staff, helping it to be part of the planning processes, grief and loss, and other things. If you're doing that, or if you get a group of people who'd like to do that, we've worked up some study questions for that, and I'd be glad to discuss anything that might come out of that. I'm going to stop. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Bill, so much. I really appreciate, again, that you were able to join us today. I would like to go over some of these questions in the few minutes that we have. And again, if any questions, if we don't get to your question, I'm taking note and we'll try to email you separately with Bill and I and try and get those questions answered. Or you can email me directly or Bill directly as well.
I've got them in front of me, the questions. I can do a quick thing. But
perfect. Yeah, go ahead. Okay.
Applying for grants, other agencies that are doing this, secular agencies that have look at Heritage Christian Services in Rochester. It's faith-based, but its money comes from Medicaid and from New York State. They really do a good job. There's another ARC in New York, and I have to get the name, and the people can come. There's an agency called, there's one in Anchorage, Alaska, Hope Community Services, that started a person working in this role, and they have said this is the best thing that they've ever done because it really helped people get connected to cultural traditions and different parts of the community. How do you do that? We can get you some of those names. How do you approach this? And Sarah's trying to collect those people, by the way, too, and find names of others. How do you approach this for people with significant disabilities who are mostly nonverbal? The people who know those people know what's important to them. And then think about, there are so many parts of being in worship or connecting with communities that are also nonverbal. A lot of people who participate in faith communities are pretty quiet, so to speak. But again, go through really good person-centered planning, and then you may need to do some exploring with those people about what aspects of spirituality or faith might be most important.
Can I add something to that, Bill?
Sure.
My biggest tip in getting to know somebody who is nonverbal is to spend as much time with them as possible and just get to know and try and enter into their world, do what they're doing. If they're on the ground a lot, get on the ground a lot, get on the ground with them, or engage in them in the way that they're engaging with you. And you'll learn, I think, a lot more about them.
There's a person who did a PhD project in the UK around working with people with profound intellectual disabilities. And what they did was, how do you get at learning the story and hearing from that person about what's their story. They might not be able to verbalize it, but with pictures and other kinds of things, you can move eventually towards getting a sense of who that is. So if you get the position of introducing somebody to that person, you've got something about their story that they can relate to, and others. That's a deep spiritual dive in lots of different directions. Again, a person who's here from France, asking the same thing. And then Mike Walker asked a question about the languages changing. There is some changing overall. I think the language of spirituality and understanding of spirituality begins to be a language where people can talk about faith and other things that are most important to people as a kind of in between the worlds of faith and the worlds of more secular services. That certainly is in regular health services. What the gap in intellectual disabilities is there's in the world of other medical care and health service, there's been huge amounts of research on the role of spirituality, not so much in the IDD world. Erik Carter and colleagues have done some of the best of it, and it's growing, but we've got a lot to do there. So if you're doing that in an agency, think about finding some graduate students at a university near you who might want a project and get them to help you do some kind of research to show the importance of this in people's lives and how it might be addressed.
I do want to let, I've gotten several requests and asking about two things, the loss assessment that Bill was talking about, and also ensuring that there's a PDF of these slides. I can attach both to a follow-up email to everybody that registered today. So you will get an email from me, and it will also have a link to the recorded video on our website. It may be a few days as we get that up there, but you can expect that email to you all in the next couple of days.
That comes out of Jeff Kaufman's book. It's an older book, Old Language, helping adults with mental retardation mourn.
So if I can't give a direct copy, I'll at least send you all the title of that book. Well, thank you all for being here. Again, if there are any other questions, my email is smckenney@stonebelt.org. So that's smckenney @stonebelt.org. You can email me, and we can try and get those questions answered for you.
And you've got my email on the slides when you got it, and I'm glad to talk through more of this with any of you, especially if you're starting some initiative within your agency. I mean, it's great fun for me to help people think through this. So,
and you did with me when I was starting this program. So again, thank you, Bill, for being here, and thank you all for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful week.
My
Take
pleasure.
care.
Be well,
Bye-bye.
people. Stay safe.